Welcome to the Pretty Powerful Podcast, where powerful women are interviewed every week to share real inspiring stories and incredible insight to help women or anyone break the barriers, be a part of innovation, shatter the glass ceiling, and dominate to the top of their sport, industry, or life's mission. Join us as we celebrate exceptional women and step into our power. And now, here's your host, Angela Gennari.
Hello, and thank you for joining me for another episode of the Pretty Powerful Podcast. My name is Angela Gennari, and today I am here with Victoria Pelletier. How are you, Victoria?
I'm great. I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you. I want to introduce Victoria. So Victoria is a 20-plus year corporate executive and board director. Nicknamed the Turnaround Queen by former colleagues and employers, Victoria inspires and empowers her team and clients to change mindsets and drive growth in business, leadership, and culture. As someone who does not subscribe to the status quo, she is always ready for new challenges, becoming one of the youngest chief operating officers at the age of 24, a president by 35, and a CEO by 41. Victoria was recognized as one of the 2023 Women of Influence by South Florida Business Journal, a semifinalist in the 2023 50/50 Women on Boards, Women to Watch, 2022 Top 30 Most Influential Business Leaders in Tech by CIO Look, in 2022, the Most Influential Entrepreneur of the Year by World Magazine, 2021's Top 50 Business Leader in Technology by Insight Magazine, and a Mentor of the Year by Women in Communication and Technology in 2020. So this is all super, super, super impressive. And then I also want to mention that you are passionate about DEI, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And you're going to talk with us a little bit today about how you got here in your journey, how you've become so prolific in what you're doing, and how your passion has kind of catapulted your career. So let's start by talking about this nickname, the Turnaround Queen. Really, really interested in that. So let's start there.
Sure. Well, thank you. I'm sorry the bio was quite the mouthful.
It's okay. It's impressive. Never apologize for how much you've achieved.
Turnaround Queen comes as a result probably of the fact that I really like solving like complex, hairy problems. I'm sort of the type that would almost break something just to put it back together again. And so I've done that a lot with businesses. I've signed myself up for or been volunteered or told take on some of those challenging projects. And a lot of times that's turning around a distressed business or a portion of a business. And a lot of that has come through, understanding certainly the financials. My career started much more on the operational side, which is where a lot of the costs sit. So learning how to run effective operations, but a lot of that comes down to leadership and culture. And so I've done that a multitude of times and also done it through merger and acquisition, which often comes with lots of synergies and, bringing things together to make them perform much more effectively, profitably, and ideally with growth.
Okay. Wow, that's amazing. So you got started in such a young age. Somebody who is, in their 20s getting promoted into a C-level position. So tell me how that started.
Well, I started working at age 11. I worked in a hair salon. So I come from like extremely humble beginnings. I never had to worry, around food insecurity or not having clothing, but there was not much money left over for anything. Never really went on a vacation. So anything I wanted above and beyond that I had to buy. So that first job was, as I said, at 11 in a hair salon. And then by 14, I was already the assistant manager of the shoe store I worked at, and then continued to progress through there. And so when I at 16 graduated high school and went to university, I was working in a bank and got promoted up through the bank extremely quickly. So when I was thinking I was going to go to law school, that was actually my plan from childhood. I decided to take a year off before I thought was going to be going to law school to continue to work in the bank because I'd been promoted. I loved being a leader, and I ended up staying there for almost 6 years and got recruited out of that organization to become a COO. And it was a massive stretch role. And I took a huge risk leaving a quote unquote safe job. And by the way, I was a brand new mother. I think my oldest, I think he was maybe only 3 months old at the time.
Oh, yeah.
They took a chance on me to some extent, but because I ticked a number of boxes. So one, I had financial services experience, and many of their clients were in the financial services world. It was an outsourcing organization and large scale contact center operations, which is what I'd been running for these, within the banking environment. I had a long work history, even though I was still quite young. And the other thing I'd say is I showed up incredibly confident. I'm not a fan of fake it till you make it, except to confidence. And when you have those jitters, you just need to show up as confidently as you possibly can.
Yeah.
So that's how I landed in that role.
Well, I love it because I think as women, and there are studies that prove this to be the case, that we will underestimate ourselves and not go after those monster opportunities because we will say, you know what, I only met 80% of the qualifications. There's no way they'll consider me, right? And in fact, I actually have a really close friend of mine who was telling me that she was applying for this job, but she was concerned because, there was one qualification that she did not quite meet. And I thought, I wonder how many people have gone through and made that when they met 20%, 40%, 50% of the qualifications because they were confident in just who they are and their ability to learn on the job, right? And so there's so much that you learn on the job that you'll never be qualified until you actually do it, right?
Agreed.
So,
and that the data I think you're quoting is, yes, it shows women typically won't apply unless they're like at 9 or 10 at the requirements. Men, the average 6.
Wow, 6 out of 10. That's amazing. I love it. And that's where that audacity, the audacity to go and do something that is probably outside of your I wouldn't say comfort zone, but I would say maybe skill set, maybe your environment. But that's how you learn, and that's how you grow, and that's how you put yourself in positions where you want to be, not necessarily where you've been, because that's growth.
Exactly.
So, okay, very cool. So you take on this COO role, and what does that lead to? So how does that transition you for the next stage of your journey?
That was probably one of the most challenging roles I've ever held, in large part because I was learning so much. I had gone from leading almost exclusively just operations to every function of that organization except for finance reported into me. So I learned a lot of technology, HR, marketing, and sales, all of those pieces. But the outsourcing world, people outsource portions of their business or function within their organization to save money. RMS for less, and they pass it off. And in that environment, if you are not incredibly adept at learning how to lead business effectively, you're going to lose money. And so the margins are just narrow. So you have to be very good at, and so I learned a lot about how to run a business in that environment. And it led to bigger and better of more of those kinds of roles. I'm incredibly values and integrity driven. And sadly, I think I was only there about 2 years when I discovered that there had been some fraudulent activity with 2 members of my team and a client and the co-founder of the organization. I reported the CEO, and it was his co-founder. And I went to him and presented what had been discovered. I terminated the 2 members of my team, but he was not prepared to address, in large part because he couldn't buy out his co-founder. And I said, I can't be a part of this. Like, I don't want my team attached to this, kind of behavior and continuing to work with this individual. And so I left, but it meant I went on to a much larger competitor of theirs where they had even bigger and better clients. So in fact, Microsoft, this is where a lot of my focus on the technology world came. Microsoft was one of our largest clients, doing a lot of their tier 1 and tier 2 tech support for their customers. And I started to travel the world with them because they had operations and delivery centers in India and other places. And so it taught me a lot about how to lead global teams as well. And then I've really stayed in that space ever since, in terms of working B2B professional services in variations of that. So whether it's been leading HR outsourcing teams, whether it's been technology outsourcing teams, consulting on how to lead more effective operations and businesses, M&A activities. So what I've learned, and this goes a little bit to that last bit in terms of, not thinking you have all the skill set. I've learned how to, where I recognize I might be missing an experience or I'll say experience more than skill. I've learned how to build the bridge and tell the story over how the experience over here will translate and I'll be able to learn and apply that in this new situation.
Right. I love it. Okay. So you are now learning, basically drinking from a fire hose, I would say, in the COO role. And I'm curious to know, when you're leading all these other teams, how did that translate with you being a woman and such a young woman? Did they give you a hard time? Was this a challenge, or did they innately say, she's got this, we don't have to worry? Like, tell me what that was like.
Angela, in that first role, I didn't have that pushback, feedback from anyone on the team. I felt it.
Wow.
Yeah, I felt the imposter syndrome. And so I'm very fortunate that I hired the right leaders of the other functions, so that we could, deliver really effectively. And we all worked well. I showed up I was 20 years younger than any other of the executives, and I was the only woman.
Wow.
By the way, part of the LGBT community, I was married to a woman before now being married to my husband.
Oh, wow.
I felt like, okay, well, I'm the only on all fronts. And so I showed up like with kind of this mask that I wore in terms, no one's going to know that I'm vulnerable, that I have fear and insecurity. I'm going to be all business all the time. And it didn't manifest poorly in that situation. I actually think it was in the next sort of hops I made from there. And that I got another nickname of Turnaround Queen, which came later, Iron Maiden.
Wow, really? Ouch.
Ouch. I'm like, that. And that's because I was making really tough business decisions, ensuring our teams were performing. And I can make those kind of decisions and have the tough conversations, but I never showed the really soft, vulnerable side of me. Like, I'm the type who cries at the Humane Society commercial.
Yeah, me
no one
too.
would have known that. So I then had to, when I realized, I'm like, that's not the kind of leader I want to be. It's not the kind of person I would want to work for.
Right.
And so I need to start showing up in a very different way. And
and
that came as a result of feeling like, because I'm the only woman, because I'm young, I need to be a certain way. Interestingly, though, it was probably in my then early 30s that still as a very senior executive where I started to get questioned. It was the first time I got I'm originally from Canada. First time I got relocated to the US, and it was a big acquisition. And I had this woman who through the acquisition became part of my team. And she had been in the industry for 35 years. And I wasn't 35 years old.
Oh, wow.
At that point. And so she kind of challenged me. So it took me a good year of working with her to being open and transparent to say, like, these are the skills I bring to the table. And Kathy, this is what you have. And this is how we're going to work together. And even then, she was a tough New Yorker. It took, like I said, it took to kind of get her on my side.
Yeah. So I'm curious about that, because I wonder if that was done out of, women can sometimes be women's worst enemy, right? Like we can hurt each other in the process. And a lot of times it comes from our own insecurities, right? Or I worked so hard to get here, you have to prove yourself too, but at the same time, sometimes it's, I want you to level up to be in a better place, right? So I just wonder what place that came from her. And of course we don't know that because we're not speaking with her, but I'm just curious about that, because I do find that as we're growing through our career journeys, sometimes our biggest challenges are other women. And so I would love to see a lot more of supportive environment for women, bringing up women through their careers. But that's interesting that it was the one person who challenged you the most was a woman. So, okay, fascinating. So then talk to me a little bit about, you become president of an organization at 35 and CEO by 41. Are these the same or different organizations?
They're different organizations.
Okay.
The longest tenure I've ever had at one organization was approximately 6 years for that bank I worked for. And ever since then, it's been 2, 3, 3.5, 4 years maximum I've worked anywhere else. So each of those have come through different opportunities. President of one travel company, and then the CEO actually came as a result of an acquisition of a company that I personally made.
Wow, that's really cool. So you made the acquisition and then you became CEO of that company. That's outstanding. I love that. So, okay, cool. So tell me a little bit. So through your journey, I mean, obviously you're the only woman in the room. You've mentioned, you might be the only one in an executive leadership team. So tell me about your experience then building out these organizations. Did you make a concerted effort to bring more diversity into the roles that you were hiring for?
Yeah, I think my focus on DE&I came as a result of, in fact, leading these BPO teams, like outsourced call center work. It's not generally a destination. Like where people say, this is where I want to spend the rest of my life. They go because they are unemployed and need to find a job. Or I often found it was new immigrants into the country who came highly skilled, but were needing to build credentials, in that, in country. And recognizing that I needed to try and get them to stay there as long as possible, feel engaged. So therefore they were performing and productive, meant I needed to make the environment a place in which they felt a strong sense of inclusion or belonging for them. So it came from that and from my experience of feeling like I was the only. So that's my focus on create, like I was leading diverse teams, but then finding a great kind of culture. And then as I moved into Fortune 500 companies from, those were some privately held organizations with massive teams, I started to see the shrink in diversity. Like they're just the diversity there. And so I became extremely involved in how do we create more diversity within our workforce, plus have this like inclusive environment. And to your point around like women not always being our greatest supporters, how do I bring people up, as I succeed in the organization? How do I rise other people, whether that be women, the LGBT community, BIPOC community? And so it's probably been 20 years that I've been like very focused on, DE&I in the companies I worked for. And in some cases then being like the executive sponsor at companies like IBM or more recently Accenture, where I was at for certain segments of their employee resource groups.
Wow. So as you're going through this, and I agree with you, especially the Fortune 500 companies, it's mind blowing, especially when you look at the New York Stock Exchange and all the publicly traded companies, how few women are at the executive or board level, and it's shocking. And I think I saw a statistic, I don't know, it was a year or so ago, and they were like, we've reached 10% of all companies have a woman on their board. I'm like, it was much higher, but it was like a woman, like they had a woman out of an entire board of directors. And I'm like, that's not an accomplishment. Like when you say 50% of because that's what we represent in the population, right? We represent 50%. And so like, I would love to see that there's 50% of women showing up on that level. But I fear that, so many women have to stop at that middle management level. And it's for a variety of reasons. I mean, let's be honest, there's a lot of things that we ourselves choose, right? Is that, we choose to stay at a level that's not executive level because of the additional responsibilities and challenges. And, we have so many other things pulling at our time, with kids and husbands and households and volunteer work. And, there's so much more expected of us as women that, we find that there's a challenge in meeting all the expectations. But so what have you found in all of your work as you're moving into these roles, because you've been there?
Yeah, you're right. I think it's sad on the not just boards, but on Fortune 500 CEOs, there was, a 1% improvement. I think 52 or 53 of 500 companies have female CEOs. And when you look at people of color, only 6. Wow. 2 of those were also women, so they counted in both categories. So like that is sad. We have to be doing much more. And I use the phrase strategic intentionality. So I'm sad to see affirmative action here in the US, go away, because the reality is if we think it's just going to happen on its own, it's not, because the needle is not moving, or certainly not fast enough. I think it was the World Economic Forum did a study around pay equity from a gender perspective. And in the US, we are still 60 years away from gender pay equity.
That's
and
crazy.
In other parts of the world, it's 120 years. So long ways to go. And so, what I'm seeing is that we have to be much more intentional in, creating programs where, and I tell companies and clients that I work with that, there doesn't have to be a trade-off for your business performance by doing the right thing. Again, having diversity brings innovation, and better problem solving, the engagement that comes by having diverse and inclusive environment. The data proves it. So you can't have both, but it means that you're going to need to make programs, whether it's formal mentorship programs. You're going to need to look at your talent in a very different way around the propensity for people to learn and bridge the skill gap that they might have, but to put, diverse, employees in different roles for sure. And so, for me, that's a big part of why I'm like such an advocate and extremely outspoken around it as well, and calling it out when I see it. I am also a public speaker. And if I'm going to be speaking at conferences or events where I see there, I might be on what they call a manel,
Yeah.
like, no, we need to have more women represented, and people of color represented as well. And I think a lot of that comes with, I recognize that even though I'm a woman that's part of the LGBT community, and I still have significant privilege in being a white woman born in North America, and now achieving a certain level of power, if you will, just by hierarchical status. But with that, comes this privilege, comes the need for me to do much, much more.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, they say, to whom much is given, much is expected, right? And so I feel like as women in leadership, it really is on our shoulders. We must do something with that, and we have, even though we've fought tooth and nail to get where we are, and that we've earned our spot, it doesn't make it any less significant that we have to do our part in bringing the next generation up as well.
And there's part of your question, Angela, I didn't answer, which is just around also what I'm saying. I do agree with you. There's a lot of women who make choices.
Yeah.
But sometimes I'll challenge. I can be a bit controversial.
Yeah, no, please. Yes, I want you to.
Challenging it. So I think, we all have choice. I say, we are the CEO of us and our career. No one's taking care of that for us. And so for me, I took that first C-suite job as a, brand new mother. My son was only 3 months old, but I had support. And so I've chosen not to give up my career. And when my second child was born, I worked the same night I gave birth by choice. She was sleeping, I've been in the hospital the same day, and online for a couple of hours. But again, that was my choice. But I'm now 47 years old, and having my children young, I've just become an empty nester. My kids are 23 and 19. But I still have this long career. And if I'd taken a gap, like I would have been so much further behind. However, I did that because I had supportive partners of my career, both in my ex-wife, who unfortunately passed away, and my husband now have both supported my career. And I've also learned to say no to the things that don't bring me personal or professional joy or value. And otherwise, I delegate and I outsource. Yeah. That is how I do it all, between wife, mother, corporate career, board work, speaking, fitness, friends, right? Like all of those. Yeah. And so I would challenge your listeners and women who do typically bear more of the brunt of the household, to challenge their partners and find alternate ways to achieve what they want without having to shelve a career.
Right. Yeah, no, I 100% agree with you. And, I've stayed single after my divorce. And one of the reasons is because it's been very, very, very challenging to find a partner who is supportive in that way. And for me, I have, since I've been divorced for 6 years, it for me has been, I felt like I had to choose either or, I had to choose, I'm going to put myself out into the dating world and focus on that, or I'm going to focus on, growing my company, because I can't take time away from my son. Right. And so like he gets, the majority of that time and concentration. And I'm very, very lucky that he's been a great child to, he's grown up with an entrepreneur mother. So he knows the drill. He's very, very self-sufficient, but yeah, and that was one of the things, is like, if you do not have a supportive partner, it is a challenge. But like, I've had to make some sacrifices, and I've had to make some choices, but those choices were supportive in what I felt like was my path. Right. And I'm not going to sacrifice my path, And so for me, my personal life has been a bit of a sacrifice, but it's okay. The right person will come along and will be supportive.
Well, I had to meet my husband on vacation in the Dominican, and it was my youngest who found out he was by himself as we were there at Christmas time, and invited him to come and join us for dinner. So
wow, that's
you
amazing.
never know.
That's amazing. So tell me about what you see as the workplace of the future. So, as we're growing and expanding and, we have a lot of the baby boomers are retiring and Generation X is kind of stepping into that executive role. Where do you see the next generation going?
I've done a lot of writing and speaking around the future of work. The reality is the future, it's here.
It's here. Yeah.
And it will continue to evolve and change. But what I see is, technology is going to continue to forever change the way in which we work.
Mm-hmm.
And, automating a lot of the more routine process type work. And so what gets left behind is the more complex problems that we're solving, the relationship building that we need to have with clients. So that's the what of the work will shift. I don't think we'll ever go back to post-pandemic into fully in the office. Obviously for different types of, like if you're in manufacturing, you need to physically be in manufacturing plants, but otherwise for lots of roles, there will be a hybrid environment. I'm personally not a fan of like full-time remote for me, but that's not that the work can't be done. I'm just a highly social individual. And so I want a hybrid opportunity where I can sit and do my Zoom calls all day, but I still want to go and meet and engage people and go and break bread and have coffee or do whatever with people. And I think that's what a lot of people want. So employers are going to need to offer that kind of flexibility in a hybrid working. But also, as you said, Gen X and the millennials and the Zs that are right behind that want a very different culture and leadership. And they want to feel like their work matters. So as leaders, our role is, how do we translate the work that they do into the impact they're having, not just on the business, but on the customers or the world, depending on the type of work or business that it is. So aligning personal values, goals, and mission with the work that they're doing. And then going back to DEI, many, not all, individuals want to work in that kind of environment, but they also want to work for leaders who are more authentic, who are transparent, whom they trust. And so it's a very different way that, the boomers and older generation were used to leading in this much more dictatorial, authoritarian style. That doesn't work anymore. So there's a very different expectation for, the leaders as well going forward.
I agree. And I was similar to you when I was in my early 20s, I was really suffering from imposter syndrome because I felt like I was taking on a lot and I thought, I'm not qualified, I'm not ready, and so I was similar to you in personality in terms of like having a very, almost a stoic personality, not very warm, and not very authentic, I felt like. And now as a CEO of my company, I am much more authentic. I'm much more vulnerable. And I feel like it's so much more connected, but it's also because I have confidence. I have innate confidence that I think allows me to be vulnerable without feeling like I'm cracking the shell of who I am. Right. And so as people become more confident and more comfortable in their own role and their own skin, and I feel like that's the one thing I feel like some future generations do better than we did is, they're more vulnerable. And I feel like there's a little bit more of that willingness to take risks and put yourself out there. And social media might be a big part of that. They're putting their whole lives on social media, and that's still something I'm becoming a little bit comfortable with. I'm still trying to learn that. Like feels very exposed, but I think that's one thing that they've done.
Yeah, I agree. Well, and there's been a big shift to a focus on a strong personal brand, and your brand is more than what you do for a day job. It is comprised of who are you as an individual, what are your interests, what are you passionate about? If you're a leader, who are you as a leader? How do you show up? And I'd say the last part of that is like, who do you want to be? What do you want to be known for? And so as a result of that, people are showing more of themselves to show the whole person that shows up versus the title that's of a certain company.
Yeah, and I think it's a lot more blended now too. Like there's no such thing anymore as balance necessarily in the way that we used to call it, like there's no before it used to be if you walk in somebody's office, the only thing you knew about their family were the pictures sitting on their desk, right? And so you didn't know their personal life outside of work. And now you can go on social media and see what they had for lunch yesterday. And so it doesn't matter.
Exactly. Well, and actually there's whole teams now, and I'll tell you, in the B2B companies I worked for, many of them have a group that just does market intelligence on the companies. So before they go and meet with a company, I mean, lots of research, here's the annual reports, here's what's on their strategic planning. But for the people they're meeting with, they do a whole bunch. You get packets. There's been times I've had to tell them, like, I don't need to know how much they paid for their home.
Right.
That's creepy. That's too much. I do want to know if they have children. Do they play sports? Like, yes, tell me those things so I can connect with them.
Yeah, exactly. So how can organizations be more mindful about DE&I? So about diversity, equity, inclusion, how can we coach our executive teams to say, this is why this matters?
Well, I think you need to get it in many leaders' heads, and some know this, but others don't. Where they think that there's this trade-off, as I said earlier, that exists between like business performance and creating diversity programs. There is not. So in many cases, it's just education to say, here's the data that shows having diverse, inclusive workplaces drive the right kind of outcomes that you want and satisfy our shareholders, and our employees, our clients, all of the various stakeholders in business. So that's one part of it. The next is working with them and people who have expertise in DEI. So this is why you see chief diversity officers. They don't own it. I want to be clear, although there's a person in many companies that's accountable for diversity. They don't own it. They're accountable for programs. They're developing the education for others. The reality is we all own it. Right. But you need leaders who know how to measure the diversity. And there's a ton of intersectionality. It's not gender, it's not race, religion, sexuality, and there's intersectionality. So how do you report on diversity and set targets for it? And then how do you build programs and being, as I said, strategically intentional, whether that's mentorship programs to help some of these, younger employees, gain the skills and access to the people who will potentially promote them, later. And then also being bold in setting targets, in terms of where you're going to get to, but be realistic. It's not changing from, 53 female CEOs in the Fortune 500 to 50% next year. But we're going to set some targets.
Yeah. Well, and I think you're so right on the data, because data speaks volumes. I know I've seen a few reports where women who are CEOs of companies on Wall Street actually bring a higher return on investment to their shareholders. So if you look at that, if you look at women who develop a sense of community in their companies versus that, that competition of where, you're strictly cost cutting. Instead of strictly cost cutting, one of our biggest cost factors is employees and engagement. And I think women do that really well. So when I hear that women need to do business like a man, I'm always like, no, we're so good at doing business our way. Like we should just keep doing what we're doing, because I think that we're bringing so much value, and that it's actually really relevant, because you brought up relationships, that relationship building piece of like our future workforce, like that's what we excel at, right? Like that's where we hit our mark. And if that's our future workforce, then why aren't there more women out there leading and developing that culture of relationship building and relationship based selling? And how do we create that culture where we're bringing people back to engagement? So
Agree.
Yeah. So you talk a little bit about relationship based selling, and so what do you think that means? Like how do relationships play into creating that strong company atmosphere?
Well, I think, both. I think it's important with employees, but also when we think about relationships with the prospective or current customers that we have, it's critically important. At the end of the day, I think we always need to think about as good as a product or service that your company might have to sell. The reality is people do business with people they like and they trust. and therefore they want to do business with them.
Yeah.
And so, and much like, so think about that from an employee perspective. Like if you're going to be asked to work overtime, coming from someone who you really like and and they're not taking advantage of that, you're probably much more willing as the employee to do that versus someone who's mean, you don't enjoy them, and you're like, you'll make an excuse. No, I can't do it. Right. So
yeah,
what I see, and this is where I've led many sales teams who and worked for some of these large companies who are constantly coming up with new offerings to walk out to our clients. And it's like, we'll just go out and like, we're going to pitch this to the client. Like, well, do you even know if they need it?
Yeah.
Right. So for me,